And right now we're going to hear from Musa, who is the CEO of Bridge Labs, a shareholder and a board member at the Brave Group and Loxton Connection. Musa is an entrepreneur and a tech solutions provider. He's also the former Nedbank Digital Marketing Group head and Facebook Africa client partner. He was among the Mail and Guardian's top 200 young South Africans in 2012 and currently chairs the University of Johannesburg School of Commerce and Information Sciences Industry Advisory Board. His passions are changing the communities that we live in particular African emerging markets, and inspiring the youth through technology. So to help us this afternoon navigate towards new connectivity in Africa, please welcome the visionary and the man of action, Musa Kalenga.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here, Bronwyn. I believe the day has been amazing so far, so I'm really keen to add to an amazing body of knowledge with a great panel of speakers, intellectuals, and contributors. So I'm really, really glad to be here. Thank you for that very generous introduction. Today I'm going to be speaking about something that obviously affects all of us, because ultimately, as we think about where we are in the world, we're going to have to be confronting typically a very new way of thinking about value creation and a very new way of us considering how we develop, build brands, and create value in this new environment that we all face. So it's safe to say that everybody's experiencing these changes, and we are definitely in a new day. And I think as a result, it's probably incumbent on all of us to think critically about how we develop new ways to tackle some of the challenges that we may face. So a little bit of a homework for everyone to do, if they haven't already. I'm sure this research report has probably been mentioned a few times already, published by the Board of Innovation, all about the shift to a low-touch economy. Now, what's really important to understand about this particular piece of research is it's quite a seminal piece of information around how people have managed from the time that COVID broke right through to now as we go into new value creation and a fundamentally new economy. It speaks about the shifts that have happened across multiple areas, multiple sectors, but primarily focused across how industry dynamics, technology, regulation, macroeconomics, geopolitics, and fundamentally human behavior have changed. So if you think about any one of these aspects and you compare it to any industry or sector, it's also important to understand that the resultant changes create opportunities for us to capitalize on. The resultant changes have been really uncomfortable, so they've forced us to do things differently. But at the same time, the resultant changes have allowed us to adopt new ways of thinking, new technologies to use, and new ways to tackle really complex and really interesting problems. It's safe to say that this great quote by Arthur C. Clarke, who's a really, really amazing science fiction writer, is relevant for the conversation that we're having today. He speaks about the fact that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And if you consider how things have evolved since the beginning of time, there was a moment where the only way to communicate was writing a letter, putting a stamp on it, sticking it in a post box, and it ended up reaching someone many months later. If at that point you told them once upon a time, this is the way we do things, but in future you'll be able to click a button and be able to send that same piece of information instantaneously to anyone, anywhere in the world, they probably would have thought that you were smoking something that was, at that time indistinguishable from magic. So as we think about these shifts that have fundamentally happened across all sectors and all industries, and we think about the advances in technology that are happening, it's always really fun to reflect on what that means in the lives that we live. Those of you that have children have probably undergone the most seismic shift to octo-parenting. So previously, you just have to worry about dropping them off at school, making sure that they've got enough to feed and hydrate them for a period of time, pick them up and bring them back home. COVID-19 has turned that all on its head. So this scene may be very familiar to all of us, because when you were just parenting in the Stone Ages, you would wait for these parent-teacher interactions for you to get a report back from how your child is performing. Typically, this would happen monthly or quarterly, and you would go there and you'd get all this data dumped, and they would tell you about how your child is actually a little shit at school. And so you get this information and you have to process it. You have to think about, oh my goodness, my child, who was my absolute pride and joy, who was my bundle of joy, is actually a disaster at school. Problem is, the lag in information from the time the incidents occurred to the time it gets reported to you is actually quite unacceptable. And so what you do is you go back home and you have the stern talking to with your child, and you hope that the next time you have a teacher-parent interaction, things are getting better. In this day and age, things are fundamentally different. I've got two children, and the way it works is that I don't necessarily have parent-teacher interactions of this nature. They've been evolved into a very different way of us interacting as parents and teachers. In fact, the model is now parents being involved, the teachers and the technology allowing us to have a better relationship. So in both my children's learning, we use Class Dojo as an example. And what Class Dojo is, it's an opportunity for a teacher to upload every single day the tasks that they're doing, the activities, take pictures, make it quite an immersive experience for a parent who can literally follow the development of their child. So with this advance in technology, think about how that changes the behavior. So previously, I think we'd gather around the table and we'd be able to have dinner, and I'd ask my kids after the fact how the day was at school. And they would obviously tell me elaborate stories, my daughter probably more so than my son, but they would explain how the day was and how it was wonderful or not wonderful and the things that they got up to. At that point, I would prod and I'd ask questions and we'd have a little bit of banter. Now, just imagine the first time I was able to be proactive. I was almost able to be intuitive about the conversation I was going to have. Why? Because I've got this curated timeline of the activities that my children are doing every single day that inform the conversation that I have. I'll tell you what that was. It was magical when it happened the first time. Why? I get home, my kids are there, we're around the table, and I say to my son, so I saw the picture that you drew of that motor car. What brand of vehicle was that? And he looked at me in a bit of a bewildered way because he didn't know how I had that information. And I did the same with my daughter. She gave me the same strange look. How did I know how her day was? Only to find out that I'm obviously plugged into Class Dojo and I've got this insight on how they're progressing from an education perspective. So this piece of technology has changed what fundamentally was a very static experience to a dynamic way that we're learning. It is an entirely new way for an entirely new day that we're in. Now, some of you may argue that education was forced to go this route, and it's absolutely true. Up until a couple of months ago, there was a lot of resistance around how education would change, not only from a technology perspective, but from a content perspective. And I always think about education as a fantastic way to build an API between our children, content they learn, and the societal experience they have at school. And the concept of an API is really quite simple. It's about understanding how the world is ultimately connected. It comes from a very technical term. Those of you that are techies on the call, the application programming interface, right? It's a set of features. You can build it so that you can integrate one thing into another to create something new. It's the same principle that Uber doesn't have to go and design a mapping infrastructure. They integrate into Google Maps. Same thing that Spotify doesn't have to go and design an infrastructure that gets payment. They integrate into Stripe. It's the same thing that a platform like Waze doesn't have to build a music interface. They integrate into iTunes. So what APIs do is they allow you to be able to create new kinds of value for a new day that we live in. So if you think about the reality of how it works, those of you that have recently bought an iPhone, I mean, back in the day when you bought a device, it was very painful, right? So you buy a new device and you have to go set it up. You have to add your contacts. It was a very manual and very archaic process. Recently, when I did buy an iPhone, you take your old iPhone, put it next to the new iPhone, you turn them on, and the old iPhone is then matched to the new iPhone. The new iPhone asks you whether it should pair with your old iPhone. You say yes, and they clone each other, and that's that, right? That's the power of an API. It's the power of ultimate connectivity to be able to create value. Now think about how much time, how much effort, and what a schlep it was to set up a new device once upon a time. And now it happens like this because of new value created in a new day that we live in. So if you think about the same principle and you put yourself as a human being, as a marketer, as a brand builder, and you consider yourself a conduit for information, a conduit for where things can flow back and forth and where you can design and create new value, it really starts to liberate how we can think about not only the industries and sectors that we're in, but also the brands and the consumers that we serve. I think that the fundamental core of thinking about it, we are all challenged to close a gap that was created in 1884. The Berlin Conference was a simple process of mapping out how the West would colonize Africa. And 200 years have happened since that point in time. So the Berlin Conference as a point in time has brought us to a point where we've got a 200-year gap between Africa and the rest of the world. The reason why we have to think about APIs critically is that we've got simply 10 years to close this gap and allow the world to be able to catch up, or allow Africa to catch up to the world. And for us to do that, we have to think about the relationship between technology and humanity. And the relationship is getting redefined all the time. And COVID-19, as well as the pandemic, has been another case study in how we have to think about it critically. So if you think about the intersection of humanity and technology, it's actually quite simple. Think about back in the day where you were a bushman walking around in the Sahara and you had to figure out how to survive. You'd play games, you'd throw rocks at one another, and ultimately you'd catch a rock and drop it, and you'd realize that when one coarse material hits another coarse material, a spark happens. You then take a piece of wood and some hay, you rub it together, and you realize smoke is created. And through that friction, you develop fire. Over time, you realize fire can actually be used as a deterrent. So when you go to sleep at night, the lions won't come and have a feast with you. You also realize that fire gives you light. You then realize that fire can help you cook things. And over time, a very basic technology responds to the age and the day, and it starts to become quite sophisticated. The same thing applies to the age and day that we're in now. We got these mobile devices, we got technology, we got connectivity, and we've got the opportunity to develop and create absolutely new value for a brand new day that we're all facing. Sometimes seeming daunting, but I think ultimately really inspiring, because if we take the bull by its horns, we've got an amazing opportunity to create new things for a new day. Now, if you think about some organizations that have taken this and are doing it really well, apolitical is one that you need to watch out for. It's a new way of working when it comes to public service and public sector. It's a collection of information and resources that were taken and curated for people working in government and public service. As we all know, it's a huge challenge around corruption, around skill, around efficiencies that we face in lots of African governments all over. And so what Apolitical did is it started to become a hub and a collection of data and information that started to empower and change the face of public service. It's an amazing intervention because young people plug into it and they start cross-pollinating ideas across geographies. They start cross-pollinating ideas across religion, across boundaries, across ethnicities, and they start developing a new body of knowledge around how we should govern and how we govern for Africa. The interesting thing about apolitical is we're starting to see it as a way that people can identify talent. We can start to see who are the people that should be representing our organizations and our governments. It's a new way of working in a fundamentally new world. We have to find a new way to eat. We know that our organizations are obviously going through changes and challenges, but at the core of it are people, and people have to be productive. And productivity is fundamentally linked to what we put in our mouths. We know the world is too many people. We know that there's a huge movement to plant, new nutritional movement to plant-based nutrition. We know that there's huge research in alternative nutrition, 3D printed foods, and GMOs. And these are all really, really important because if we don't change the way that we eat, we're going to face with a challenge around productivity. I believe at its core, productivity is what drives nations forward. And productivity is something that we all have to do as human beings. And so food security becomes a crucial thing that we have to debate, discuss, and understand because we have to create a new way for this brand new day. So I believe at the core of the many challenges that we face as a continent, we have to start solving for a new way to eat. It's also interesting that when we look at the data that is presented to us and you consider some of the political and social unrest that's happened globally since 2004, it's interesting to see that the food price index was actually quite high, preceding every single social unrest that happened. And so could it be that hunger is a predictor for social unrest and political instability? Something to think about. I also think that there's a new way to communicate. One of the things that I used to do in my previous life is I worked for a small business called Facebook. So I spent a lot of time on airplanes and in many different hotel rooms. The one thing that I used to crave for every time I got to a foreign place with a beautiful view was just to connect with my family. I know a lot of hotels during this time have closed down and have faced major challenges, but imagine the innovation that could come out of hotels thinking about a new way to communicate. Imagine flying 16 hours and being able to put on a set of headsets and I could say goodnight to my daughter. Or I could have a chat with my son and coach him on the new move that he's learning for his soccer academy. That would fundamentally change things for me, not only as a consumer, but it would also be a way that I connect to my family as a human being. We also need to figure out a new way to lead. I think we are challenged in a number of different ways when it comes to Africa, but if you look at the movements that are happening all over the world, they're being driven fundamentally by young people taking up the mantle to lead. Partnerships across generations. If you think about a good friend of mine, Rapelang, and a partnership with Wendy Ackerman, there's kind of been this coaching and mentorship relationship where two generations have created an API and they gain value from each other. We have to have a new way to lead and we have to find new ways to go forward.
You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. But I don't care about being popular. I care about climate justice and a living planet. Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes.
A rather chilling keynote that was delivered by Greta Thunberg, effectively calling us out, effectively saying that we are sacrificing the many for the benefit of the few. And I can completely see my daughter, who's 4 years old, having exactly the same viewpoint and exactly the same opinion. So changing who's leading and who's having the conversation and driving the discussion is critical to how we're going to respond to the new day that we're in. Closer to home, the same kind of discussions are starting to become mainstream, and it's really quite exciting to see as it unfolds and happens right in front of us.
I'm sick and tired of the same old people on the same old channels saying the same old things. It's time to switch it up, it's time to disrupt, and it's time to let these old folks in their old age homes, always talking about politics and doing politics, retire and let some new voices come to the fore. The problem is no one's going to do it for us. I've given up on thinking someone else is going to help us. We just need to start our own platforms, do our own things. And that's exactly what we're going to do with SMWX. Make sure you stay tuned. Aye.
SMWX, if you haven't seen it already, you must check it out. A movement driven by a young South African passionate about creating new platforms and new voices, because we have to find new leaders for a new day. We need a new way to look at women. I think one of the key things about our continent is we've got the youngest population in the world of 200 million people between the ages of 15 and 24. We know that of that population of individuals, those that are going to drive the most amount of impact and change within society are the female leaders. If we're not identifying them, if we're not putting them on a pedestal, supporting them and giving them as much as they need, we're not creating a new way to lead, and we're not creating a new way to look at the world. I think it's a massive challenge, not only for corporates, but for organizations that are trying to develop and figure out how to map the future. So if we're to bring it all together, a trampoline for the new day and the way that we do new things is that we have to change how we live and how we work. It's fundamental for us to focus on things that are important and ensure that we secure the smallest unit of the economy, which is the family. We have to change what we eat. Our relationship with food and the link to productivity is undoubted, and that's an important part of how we're going to be able to survive and become productive. The way we communicate and the way we are governing is a critical way for us to bring our organizations together and have impact at economic level. And most importantly, the people that are leading and in charge have to become younger and have to become more female. And I think if we do those things, we are paving the way for a fundamentally different trajectory for our continent. And hopefully in the next 10 years, where we have to close that gap, we're actually going to leapfrog the rest of the world. So I thank you for your attention and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks so much, Musa. We've got a few questions over here. Perhaps we'll start with one of the harder questions, which is, do you have any advice for SME business owners who are trying to rebuild in very, very tight and creative constraints right now? Bearing in mind, of course, it is vitally important for our SMEs to be thriving, because that's where the future of job growth is going to come for a country that already has a massive unemployment challenge. So that question's from Kwazi.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I think it is a difficult question, but my philosophy is quite simple for small businesses, is that you need to be looking in the blind spots, right? So for any small business that's trying to create value, what has happened over the last couple of months is an amazing opportunity, because demand and supply have shifted forever. And so as a small business, fortunately, you should have the agility to be able to find blind spots that are created by people that are exiting, or by environments that are consolidating suppliers and the market, for you to be able to create new value. Now, when you look at for blind spots, they typically don't look like the traditional opportunities. Sometimes it might start out as a hunch. Sometimes it might start out as something that is just kind of bothered you, but you haven't thought about it a lot. It may not be the blatant thing that is looking at you straight in the face and saying, I am a business. But I think my big advice is spend time looking in the blind spots that are created by all the changes that have happened in markets.
Thank you very much. And then you spoke quite a lot about the importance of getting young blood into leadership positions in both the public and in the private sector. So we have two questions over here. The first one from Mignon, who's asking if you've got any tips for young people who are stepping into authoritative positions, so have been given the opportunity to play in a space where their voice is being heard. What advice would you have to get them to make sure that their ideas are heard and actioned by people who might be older than them that have to listen to their advice?
Sure. So first rule is don't mess it up. The second rule is refer to the first rule. No, I'm just joking, right? So I think it's a privilege and an honor as a young person to be given the mantle of responsibility and leadership. So I think the important thing is, A, don't be fooled by the fact that you're probably not going to know a lot about the environment that you're stepping into. So you need to surround yourself with a very solid base of advisors, people that are speaking into your context, people that have been there before you. They may not necessarily be in the organization, but they've understood some of the dynamics that you're dealing with. That set of advisors gives you a sober and more considered view on some of the challenges that you may face. The second thing is, don't try and boil the ocean. Don't do everything, right? It's very difficult for you to create value if your focus is split across lots of stuff. I've always been a believer that you choose 3 to 5 impactful things per year, per quarter, per month, whatever it may be. Focus on those things, deliver impact, and when you do, use that as a case study to show to everybody else that you are delivering value. And I think incrementally, as you do that, and as you're bouncing off the advisory network that you build, I think it becomes a body of support around not only your capability, but it shows that you're adding value incrementally. The last thing is, don't get frustrated. You're ultimately going to face lots of pushback. You're ultimately going to be in a position where your voice seems to be drowned out. Sometimes it's better to ask forgiveness and then permission if you have conviction that you're doing the right thing. So that's what I advise you kind of do as a young person in that position.
Fantastic. And this is a similar question, kind of following on from there. It's well and good promoting young people into leadership positions, but we do have to be careful as societies and as companies that we're not trying to abdicate responsibility for bad decisions that older generations or prior leaders have made and then sort of dumping the having to deal with the consequences onto the next generation of leaders. So do you have any advice for young leaders that might have been promoted almost as and now feeling like scapegoats, that they've been placed to clean up other people's mess? And at the same time, do you have any advice for older leaders as to how to avoid that? Because it is a real temptation when we are dealing with complicated, messy human problems.
You're absolutely right. And I almost consider that a standard operating procedure. So it's like when you decide to become a fireman, you're likely to interact with fire at some point in your life, right? So this period that we see of young people coming in and becoming scapegoats, I see that as standard operating procedure, because until we have kind of almost reached the same level of value contribution, there is always going to be that opportunity to try and kind of find someone to blame it on, right? I think it should be for a period of time. It shouldn't be the prevailing way things are handled. And I think through that period, what you need to do is focus on creating and adding value so that you stop being seen as a scapegoat, but as a value-adding member. Now, that takes a bit of patience, it takes some maturity, and it takes some time, but it also means you have to manage up, right? It means that you have to be conscious and aware of whoever it is that might be passing the buck, and you need to manage them in such a way that they can see you as someone that contributes value and not as someone that's just simply a scapegoat. So I think, as I said, I think it's unfortunately horses for horses. We are in a context where there are going to be a generation that feel a particular way, and us younger Thundercats feel a different way. And there's always going to be that opportunity to kind of pass the buck. But I don't think it's a very easy thing to escape unless you're creating value and you're changing their mindsets as you go along.
Thanks very much. That's an excellent answer. I think it's very valuable to the younger listeners on this call here today in particular. And then we've got one more question before I will let you go back into the audience if you're going to be staying around with us for the rest of the afternoon. And that is a question from Tria, who is asking, do you think technology will take us closer or further away from reducing social ills such as prejudice and discrimination?
Great question. And I think ultimately, if the technology is used properly, it should take us closer to reducing social ills like discrimination. I forget the name of the company, but there's a business in the US that was set up on trying to effectively reduce the bias that is present in the hiring process in most corporates. So what that means is someone in the HR department receives a CV, they screen the CV. As they're looking through the CV, they see this person went to St. John's, they're a white male, they pick up all the cues that confirm their own bias. They then look at another CV that's from, Soweto, Supatila High, and all the cues that they don't kind of identify with. Depending on who you are as the HR person, you're going to pick the CV that most aligns to your own bias, whether or not you identify with one or the other. So she created a business that effectively takes CVs and screens them and removes any cues that would trigger bias in the approver of that CV, and presents a piece of information so someone makes a call based on the content and the merit of the CV and not on the triggers that has been used. And that is a technology. It's an algorithm that works, and it's one that's reducing bias in the way people are hired. So in those applications, absolutely, it takes us closer to being able to reduce the bias. But once again, you need people that are thinking about the world very differently and about those problems and designing the solutions that are commercially viable and that people are willing to use to be able to make those changes. So I think it absolutely can help us, but we need the people to create the solutions.
Absolutely. I love that example. I term that sort of thing clean tech. So tech's almost like a sort of stamp of certification saying that your technology is, socially just. And one of the examples there would be the Algorithmic Justice League. I'm not sure if that's the lady you're referring to, but I know there are a couple of tech ethicists who are working on similar projects. It was actually one of the big trends we tracked last year. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because technology really is a tool. That does not mean to say that it is neutral. It is applied according to the people that are using it. So we have to be very, very careful that we're not automating injustice and that we are rather automating progress and progressive progress in particular. But thank you so much, Musa. And we'll see you soon.
All right, take care. Cheers, guys.